The memorial service for my brother Thomas was small. Just me, a handful of his restaurant staff, and a few neighbors from the beach community where he'd spent his final years. I stood in the ocean breeze, scattering his ashes where he'd asked, thinking about how he'd lived simply, almost invisibly. The restaurant building he owned had always seemed modest to me, nothing fancy. Just a sturdy brick building on a busy corner where someone else ran a seafood place. He rented it out, collected checks, and spent his time fishing. When his attorney called 3 days later, I thought it was just paperwork formalities. I'd been Thomas's only living relative since our parents passed. We'd been close, in that quiet sibling way where you don't talk often but you're always there. "Mrs. Harrison, I need to schedule a time for us to go through your brother's estate," the attorney said. His voice had a careful quality, like he was choosing words precisely. Estate? Thomas had the restaurant building, sure, but estate seemed like a grand word for what I'd assumed was a simple rental property situation. "Of course," I said, "but I thought Thomas lived pretty modestly. Is there much to handle?" A pause. Then, "Mrs. Harrison, your brother's estate is valued at approximately $1.2 million. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. $1.2 million? That couldn't be right. Thomas wore the same fishing vest for 20 years. He drove a truck older than my grandchildren. Where on earth? I'm sorry, could you repeat that? $1.2 million, approximately. The commercial property alone is worth $750,000. Then there's the beach house, the investment portfolio, and some cash assets. You're the sole beneficiary, Mrs. Harrison. Everything comes to you." I sat down hard on my kitchen chair, staring at the wallpaper I'd been meaning to replace for a decade. Thomas had been secretly wealthy? All those years of him showing up to family dinners in worn flannel shirts, insisting on splitting the check at restaurants, and he'd been sitting on this kind of money? The attorney, Mr. Patterson, explained that Thomas had been a careful investor. The restaurant building had tripled in value over 30 years. The tenants paid rent that Thomas immediately invested in blue-chip stocks. The beach house, purchased for almost nothing in the 70s, was now prime coastal real estate. My simple, quiet brother had built wealth methodically, invisibly. "He wanted you to have security, Mrs. Harrison," Mr. Patterson said gently. His instructions were very specific. Everything is to be transferred to you individually. He was quite insistent about that wording in the will. Individually. At the time, I thought it was just legal precision. I didn't understand yet that Thomas, in his quiet way, had been protecting me. I was 63 years old. My husband had passed 6 years earlier from a heart attack, leaving me with a teacher's pension and the house we'd raised our son Daniel in. It was enough to live on. But just enough. I budgeted carefully, clipped coupons, waited for sales. The idea of having over $1 million was incomprehensible. I could travel, finally see Europe like I'd always dreamed. I could help Daniel and his wife Jessica with their new house. I could set up college funds for my future grandchildren. I drove to the attorney's office in a daze, barely remembering the route. Mr. Patterson walked me through stacks of documents, property deeds, investment statements. The restaurant building currently housed a successful seafood restaurant called The Catch. The owners had a 10-year lease and paid $7,500 a month. The beach house was rented out through a vacation service, bringing in another $4,000 monthly. The stock portfolio was diversified, steady, exactly the kind of conservative investing you'd expect from someone like Thomas. "Your brother was adamant that these assets remain in your name alone," Mr. Patterson said again, looking at me over his reading glasses. He specified that the property should not be added to any joint accounts or marital property. "Given that you're widowed, that's less of a concern," but he was very clear. "Thomas never married," I said absently, running my finger down a column of numbers. I suppose he didn't think about those things. Mr. Patterson's expression suggested he disagreed, but he didn't say anything. Later, I would understand what he'd already recognized. Thomas had thought about it very carefully indeed. I signed the papers. The attorney assured me everything would be transferred to accounts in my name only within 2 weeks. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in years. The weight of constant financial worry, of calculating every purchase, of anxiety about retirement costs lifted. I was free. I was secure. and I couldn't wait to share the news with Daniel. My son had always been a good boy. Not perfect, but good. He'd married Jessica 4 years ago, a sharp woman who practiced real estate law at a firm downtown. They'd bought a house in one of those new developments, all granite countertops and open floor plans, though I privately thought they'd stretched themselves financially. Daniel worked in sales for a medical supply company, good money but commission-based. Jessica's income was steadier. I'd been babysitting their golden retriever, Max, while they went to some work conference in Chicago. They weren't due back for another day, but I was at their house, feeding Max and watering the plants. I'd just finished filling the dog's bowl when I noticed the light on in Daniel's home office. I should have just turned it off. That's what I told myself later, over and over. But something made me walk into that room. Maybe it was the way papers were spread across the desk, unusual for my usually neat son. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fate. The document on top was a printout of property listings. Luxury condos downtown, prices ranging from $800,000 to over $1 million. I frowned. Daniel and Jessica had just bought their house 2 years ago. Why were they looking at condos? Then I saw my name. A yellow legal pad lay beside the listings, covered in Jessica's precise handwriting. I recognized it from birthday cards and Christmas notes. Margaret's Assets was written at the top, underlined twice. My hands went cold. Below that, Restaurant building minus $750K, est. Beach house minus $280K, est. Stocks minus $450K, cash minus $50K. Total. To $1.53 m. Their estimate was high, but close enough that my stomach turned. This was dated 3 days ago, the day after Thomas's memorial, before I'd even met with the attorney. How did they know? I kept reading. My vision tunneling. Timeline. M inherits early May. Wait 2 to 3 months for grief period to pass. D approaches about helping manage assets. Suggests selling beach house first. Least emotional attachment. Use proceeds for family investment opportunity. Once trust established, move to restaurant building. Suggests selling to avoid landlord hassles. Put proceeds into joint investment account for her security. Transfer to our control gradually. Target, 80% of assets within 18 months. Below that, a second section. Talking points for D. Mom, you've never dealt with this kind of money. Let me help you. You trust me, right? We're family. We should keep this in the family. Think about your future grandchildren. We can all benefit together. And at the bottom, underlined 3 times. Keep everything friendly. She's trusting and non-confrontational. Classic retired teacher personality. Won't push back if we frame it as helping her. J stays in background, supportive but not pushy. This is D's relationship to leverage. I stood in that office, staring at my son's handwriting mixed with his wife's, and felt something inside me crack open. Classic retired teacher personality. Won't push back. Relationship to leverage. They weren't seeing me as Daniel's mother. They were seeing me as a mark. I thought about every dinner where Jessica asked pointed questions about Thomas. Did your brother have any investments, Margaret? Any property besides that restaurant building? I'd thought she was making conversation. She'd been gathering intelligence. I thought about Daniel's casual questions. Mom, who's handling Uncle Thomas's estate? Do you need help with any of the paperwork? I'm good with that kind of stuff. I'd thought he was being a concerned son. He'd been positioning himself. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The legal pad, the condo listings, every page. Then I carefully replaced everything exactly as it had been, turned off the light, and walked out of that house like I was moving through water. Max wagged his tail at me, innocent and trusting. I gave him one last pat and left. At home, I sat in my quiet living room as the sun set, staring at the photos on my phone. Part of me wanted to believe I'd misunderstood. Maybe it was a creative writing exercise. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe there was some explanation that didn't mean my only child had been planning to manipulate me out of my inheritance the moment he'd learned about it. But I knew. Deep in my bones, I knew. And I knew something else too. Thomas had known. That's why he'd been so specific about the assets staying in my name only. Somehow, my quiet brother had seen something in Daniel, or in Jessica, or in their marriage, that I'd missed. He'd been protecting me even after death. I called Mr. Patterson first thing the next morning. "I need to ensure that my brother's assets are absolutely protected," I said. "What are my options?" If he was surprised by the question, he didn't show it. "Well, as I mentioned, the will specifies individual ownership, but I'd recommend setting up a trust for additional protection. We can structure it so that the assets cannot be touched by anyone else, cannot be added to joint accounts, and cannot be subject to any claims except your own decisions. Let's do that, as quickly as possible." "May I ask what's prompted this concern?" I hesitated, then said, "Let's just say my brother was wiser than I initially realized." We set up the trust that week. Everything went into the Margaret Harrison Irrevocable Trust, with me as the sole beneficiary and Mr. Patterson's firm as trustee. No one could access, sell, or transfer those assets without my explicit written consent and the trustee's approval. It cost me $10,000 in legal fees. It was the best money I ever spent. Daniel and Jessica came back from Chicago on a Thursday. I went to dinner with them that Friday, watched them smile at me across the table at the Italian restaurant we always went to. Jessica asked how I was holding up after Thomas's death. Daniel squeezed my hand and said, "I'm here for you, Mom, whatever you need." I smiled back and said, "Thank you, honey. That means so much." I didn't tell them about the inheritance. Not yet. 3 weeks passed. I spent that time doing research. I hired a private investigator, something I never thought I'd do in my life. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. What I learned made my blood run cold. Jessica had been fired from her previous law firm for misappropriating client funds from an estate case. The firm had quietly settled to avoid scandal, and she'd managed to get licensed again, but the pattern was there. She'd done this before. Daniel, my son, had gambling debts. $50,000 owed to online poker sites and sports betting platforms. His perfect suburban life was a facade hiding financial disaster. They needed money desperately, and I, with my classic retired teacher personality, had just inherited $1.2 million. The investigator found something else, too. Jessica had been accessing public records, pulling information about Thomas's properties within days of his death. She'd known about the inheritance before I did. She'd probably called in favors at the county recorder's office, used her legal connections. They'd been planning this from the beginning. I sat with this information for another week, feeling it settle into my bones. I grieved during that time. Not for Thomas. I'd already grieved him properly. I grieved for the relationship I'd thought I had with my son, for the illusion of family I'd been living in. Then I got angry. Daniel finally made his move 6 weeks after Thomas's memorial. He invited me to lunch, just the two of us. We sat at a cafe near his office, and he ordered my favorite sandwich without asking, the way he'd done since he was a teenager, trying to be thoughtful. "Mom," he said, leaning forward with concern etched on his face, "I've been worried about you. This inheritance, it's a lot to handle. Have you thought about what you're going to do with it?" There it was, the opening move, exactly as scripted on that yellow legal pad. I took a sip of my iced tea and said, "Actually, I've already handled it. Everything's been set up in an irrevocable trust, very secure, very protected." His face went blank for just a second. Then the concern reassembled itself. "A trust? Mom, those can be complicated. Did you have a lawyer help you?" Thomas's estate attorney. Very thorough man. He made sure everything is exactly as Thomas wanted. All the assets are protected and will remain in my control only. Your control only? Daniel's smile got tighter. "Mom, that seems... we're family. What if something happens to you? What if you need help managing everything?" "The trust has provisions for all of that," I said calmly. "And actually, Daniel, I wanted to talk to you about something." I pulled out my phone and brought up the photos, slid it across the table to him. "I was at your house a few weeks ago, feeding Max. I saw these in your office." I watched the color drain from his face as he looked at the screen. The legal pad, his handwriting, Jessica's handwriting, the timeline, the strategy, all of it. "Mom, I can explain." "Can you?" I kept my voice steady, quiet. The cafe buzzed around us, people laughing, having normal lunches with their normal families. Can you explain how you and your wife planned to manipulate me out of my inheritance before I even knew I had one? Can you explain classic retired teacher personality won't push back? Can you explain treating your own mother like a mark in a con? It wasn't like that. Relationship to leverage, Daniel. That's what you wrote. Our relationship. The one where I gave birth to you, raised you, supported you through everything. That relationship is something to leverage. His mouth opened and closed. No words came out. I found out about Jessica's past, I continued. The client funds she stole, your gambling debts. I know everything, Daniel. I know exactly why you need money and exactly what you were planning to do to get it. People at nearby tables were starting to glance over. Daniel noticed. His face flushed red. You had no right to invade our privacy. I had every right to protect myself from theft. My voice was still calm, but something in it made him stop talking. Because that's what this was, Daniel. Theft. Planned, premeditated theft from your own mother. We would have helped you. Helped me? I almost laughed. You were going to help me right out of my security. Right out of the future your uncle worked his entire life to give me. Did you know Thomas specifically structured his will to protect these assets? He knew, Daniel. Somehow, he knew what you were capable of. That hit him. I saw it in his eyes. Here's what's going to happen, I said. I'm leaving now. You're going to think very carefully about the choices you've made, and then you're going to decide whether you want to be my son or whether you want to keep being whatever you and Jessica have turned into. I stood up, leaving my sandwich untouched. Mom, please. I love you, Daniel. I always will. But I will not let you steal from me, and I will not pretend this didn't happen. I walked out of that cafe with my head high, even though my heart was breaking. Jessica called that night. I didn't answer. She called 6 more times. Then the text started. Long paragraphs about misunderstandings, about Daniel being stressed, about how they'd only wanted to help, about family sticking together. I blocked her number. Daniel showed up at my house 2 days later. I saw him through the window, standing on my porch, his hand raised to knock. He looked smaller somehow, younger, like the boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and bad dreams. I wanted to open the door. Every maternal instinct in me screamed to let him in, to fix this, to make it okay. But I thought about that legal pad. Won't push back. Leverage. I stayed on my couch until he finally left. Mr. Patterson called me a week later. Mrs. Harrison, I've received a letter from a law firm representing your son and daughter-in-law. They're contesting the trust structure, claiming undue influence and suggesting you're not mentally competent to make these decisions. I'd been expecting this. Jessica was a real estate lawyer, but she had connections in estate law. What are our options? Frankly, they don't have a case. You established the trust with full mental capacity, with my firm's guidance, and in accordance with your brother's clearly stated wishes. But we'll need to respond legally. It will cost money. It might get ugly. Do it, I said. Whatever it takes. It got ugly. Jessica's firm filed paperwork suggesting I had early-stage dementia. They claimed Daniel had been trying to help me, and I'd paranoidly rejected his assistance. They dragged my brother's name through proceedings, suggesting he'd manipulated me in his final days. Each legal filing felt like another betrayal. But I had the evidence, the investigator's report on Jessica's past, the documentation of Daniel's debts, and most importantly, those photos of their planning documents. My attorney, Mr. Patterson, was merciless. He deposed Jessica about her previous misconduct. He subpoenaed Daniel's financial records, exposing the gambling debts. He brought in the investigator to testify about the timeline of Jessica accessing property records before I'd even been informed of my inheritance. In the deposition, when confronted with photos of her own handwriting planning to manipulate me, Jessica tried to claim it was a thought exercise for a novel she was writing. A novel, Mr. Patterson repeated flatly, about manipulating elderly women out of inheritances. How creative. The judge wasn't amused. 6 months after that lunch at the cafe, the case was dismissed with prejudice. The judge's written opinion noted that the attempt to declare me incompetent while simultaneously claiming I'd been competent enough to be manipulated showed a fundamental inconsistency that suggests bad faith litigation. They were also ordered to pay my legal fees, $75,000. Jessica's law firm quietly let her go. Word had spread about the case, about her past, about what she'd tried to do. Daniel's company transferred him to a smaller territory, effectively a demotion. I took no pleasure in their fall. I just felt tired. A year passed. I sold the beach house, not because anyone pressured me, but because I realized I didn't want the headache of managing a vacation rental. I kept the restaurant building. The tenants were reliable, the income steady. I diversified the stock portfolio a bit more, taking Mr. Patterson's advice. I traveled. I saw Paris, Rome, London. I stayed in nice hotels and ate at good restaurants and didn't look at prices. I donated to my old school district, funded scholarships for teaching students. I set up a trust for any grandchildren I might someday have, structured so their parents couldn't touch it. I made a new will, carefully considered. Some money would go to educational charities, some to animal shelters, in Max's honor. And yes, some to Daniel, but in a trust he couldn't access until he was 65, with provisions requiring financial counseling and debt management. I hoped by then he'd have grown into someone who could appreciate it properly, but I wasn't holding my breath. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, I went back to the beach where I'd scattered his ashes. I stood in the same spot, watching the same waves, and I talked to him. "You knew," I said to the wind. "You tried to protect me. Thank you." I thought about what I'd lost. My relationship with my son, fractured maybe beyond repair. My innocence about family, about trust, about love. But I also thought about what I'd gained. Self-respect, financial security, the strength to stand up for myself, even when it meant standing alone. A woman walking her dog passed by and smiled at me. I smiled back. She didn't know my story, didn't know the battles I'd fought or the betrayals I'd survived. She just saw an older woman enjoying a beautiful day at the beach, and maybe that was enough. I was 64 years old. I was wealthy. I was independent. I was alone. But I was free. The restaurant building needed some repairs that month, and I met with the tenants personally to discuss them. They were a married couple, both chefs, who'd built the Catch from nothing into a local favorite. They reminded me a little of Thomas, hard-working and humble. "Mrs. Harrison," the wife said after we'd discussed the repairs, "we wanted to thank you for being such a good landlord. The previous owner, your brother, he was always fair with us. You're the same way. It's rare. Thomas would have wanted me to take care of you," I said. "You made his building into something special." As I drove home that day, I realized something. Thomas's real gift hadn't been the money. It had been the example. He'd lived simply, invested wisely, helped others quietly. He hadn't let wealth change him. He'd used it as a tool for security and generosity, nothing more. I could do the same. Daniel sent me a birthday card the next month. No return address, just a card with a generic message and his signature. No apology, no explanation. Just "Happy birthday, Mom. Love, Daniel." I kept it. I didn't respond. Maybe someday I would. Maybe someday he'd be ready to have a real conversation about what had happened, about who he'd become and who he wanted to be. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe this was who he was now. Either way, I was okay. I'd learned that love and boundaries could coexist. That being a mother didn't mean being a victim. That family wasn't just about blood, it was about respect and trust. I thought about all those years of clipping coupons, of calculating every purchase, of small anxieties about retirement. That version of me felt like a different person now. Not because of the money itself, but because I'd fought for it. I'd stood up to my own child and refused to be used. Thomas had given me wealth, but I'd given myself something more valuable. I'd given myself dignity. And as I sat in my quiet house that evening, looking at photos from my Paris trip, planning my next adventure to Greece, I realized I'd never felt richer in my life. Not because of what I had, but because of what I'd refused to lose.